France, in the in France, in the United Kingdom, started to brought it back from Africa and India, and started to marvel at the properties of this interesting plant. So it was introduced in modern science. I like the date of 1845 because that's when a French psychiatrist by the name of Jacques Moreau de Tours wrote a really wonderful book on cannabis, but describes the property of the plant quite in detail. It became soon after its introduction in science, it became a medicine. It was placed in the pharmacopoeias of countries across the world, in Europe, in the United States, where it remained for almost a century until about 1940. It was eliminated. It was removed from the USP, from the United States Pharmacopoeia, in 1942. And the reason for that, mainly, although not uniquely, was the Marijuana Tax Act that Bob has referred to in his lecture, when really cannabis became effectually illegal. And the main impact that this act had on society was not so much to reduce the consumption of cannabis, which was not that widespread, but was really to halt any research effort on it. So everything happened very, very, very slowly, but not completely halting it, just making it very, very hard for people, for scientists to work on it. And toward as the war started and hemp now became important again, because there was a hemp effort, and I'm sure many of you must have heard about it. Anyway, hemp being so useful was brought back into the fold of legality, and people started to try to study its properties. And in 1944, the active principle that is responsible for the intoxicating properties of cannabis, or psychoactive properties of cannabis, was discovered by Roger Adams. And then 20 years later, it was fully characterized by Rafi Meshulam in Jerusalem, in Israel, as what we call now tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC. You have heard already about this Controlled Substance Act, which of 1970, which confirmed illegality. And again, I want to stress one important point here. Between 1937 and 1970, there was no major scientific discovery that made it clear that this plant was dangerous and therefore it had to be made illegal. No such thing happened. In fact, if anything, scientists, they didn't know a lot about it, but whatever they knew suggested that the drug was essentially harmless. Yes, psychoactive, but not as dangerous as other substances of abuse, including in particular morphine and cocaine. Still, it was rendered illegal again. And this illegality really slowed things down. I don't want to belabor this point, but if you intend to study THC, you're up against a wall of paperwork, and it's not impossible, but certainly scientists are busy. We're busy writing grants, we're busy writing papers, and if we have to add additional paperwork, additional red tape to our daily routine, we're certainly not happy to do it, and so that slowed down a lot of things. Now, but nevertheless, cannabinoid receptors were discovered. So the scientists were able to identify the receptors, the receptor proteins on cells that are responsible for the effect of THC, and that occurred between 1988 and 1990. Soon after, the brain endocannabinoid system was discovered, and I'll say a few things about that in a couple of minutes. And now here we are toward the end of 2020. And after the last elections, I think the number of states in which cannabis is legal, either for medical or for recreational use, is up to 47. I might be wrong, but we're close to the entirety of the United States. And still, there are so many things that we do not know. And I credit the legislation that we have 100% for this ignorance, because if we did not have these hurdles, we would be way more advanced. So one thing we know now very well, that when people use cannabis and they seek not just the intoxication, but also the vast majority of its um, medicinal effects, one is really, what they really need is a cannabis that contains THC. And Ziva Cooper will talk more about another component of cannabis, cannabidiol or CBD. But again, when one thinks about cannabis, as it's perceived in popular culture, the drug that causes intoxication, but also can give analgesia, those are all effects that are linked to THC. They've been ascribed to THC. And how does THC work? We know now that THC combines with the protein present on the surface of cells. It's called the receptor. It's called the receptor for THC. So cannabinoid receptor or CB receptor. And this receptor binds THC and changes its shape, its conformation upon binding the chemical. And because its shape changes, it induces a series of events inside the cells that lead eventually to the response that we're all familiar with. And what you're seeing here is a real actual PET imaging scan of cannabinoid receptors in the brain of a human. There are actually more than one receptor. There are two receptors, and what you see here is a sort of pretty fanciful rendering. The point here is not so much to say this is really the way these receptors look, but to highlight how different they are. One is called CB1, the other is called CB2. The CB1 type is the one that is most abundant in the brain. In fact, is one of the most abundant receptors in the brain, period. Even compared to transmitter receptors like dopamine receptors or opiate receptors, way more cannabinoid receptor than any of those other guys. So that's an interesting thing. But cannabinoid receptors of the CB1 type are also present outside the brain, in peripheral neurons, and also in weird cell types you would not expect to have them, because again, popularly we assume that cannabis, 100% of its action are in the brain, right? Intoxication is something that happens in the brain. But in fact, there are cannabinoid receptors throughout the body where they serve very, very important functions. Adipocytes, which are the cells that where we store our fat, they're called white fat cells or adipocytes, contain them. Cells in the liver, hepatocyte contain them, vascular cells, et cetera, et cetera. The CB2 receptor is a little bit more restrained or restricted rather in its localization. It's present mainly in cells of the immune system, both innate and adaptive systems. Cells like lymphocytes, macrophages express it. But these cells are present everywhere in the body. Macrophages in particular are present in every organ system in the body. So we can safely say that when an individual uses cannabis and absorbs THC, all the body gets to know about it, because CB1 receptors in the brain and in all these other tissues, and CB2 receptors in innate and adaptive immune cells bind to THC, which actually then ends up having effects. That's an interesting thing that we all need to keep in mind. So the brain is the center of our attention today, because, as I said, those are the most obvious effects of cannabis. They're mediated by the brain. And what you see here is a scheme showing the localization of CB1 cannabinoid receptors in the human brain. The density of the receptor is shown here as a pseudo color, so to speak. So you can see there are certain regions of the brain that contain a lot of the receptors, others that contain a little bit less, and others that contain very little. So without going into too much neuroscience here, a lot of these regions explain stuff that happens, to people who use cannabis. For example, the present in the cerebellum, and which is involved in the regulation of balance. It could involve, could be responsible for some of the effects on dizziness, for example. The presence of the receptor in the cortex, the mantle that covers the brain and is involved in our higher brain function. may be involved in some of the cognitive effects and so on and so forth. But the most important thing that I like to point here is not so much where the receptor is. You notice that it's almost everywhere, but there are some regions where there are few such receptors. And one of them in particular I'd like to highlight to you is this little guy here. It's called the pre-Botzinger complex, and it's a part of the brainstem being this part here of the brain, a part of the brainstem that controls respiration. So the fact that there are no cannabinoid receptors in that region is important because that region controls respiration. So if you have if you mess up that region, what happens is that you have respiratory depression, respiratory problem. And that's what happens with the opiates and opioids. So everything that derives from morphine, fentanyl, carfentanil, etc. All these drugs have very profound effects on the pre-Botzinger complex, and that's why they can kill people. The overdosing usually is due to activation of opioid receptors in the pre-Botzinger complex. There are few cannabinoid receptors there, and that's the reason why cannabis doesn't really kill people that easily at all, if at all. So there are receptors in the brain. We've seen that there are receptors outside the brain. Outside, we have both CB1 and CB2. And what you see here in this scheme is really to give you a general sense of how many different functions this receptor serves. We are looking at the vasculature, for example, where cannabinoid receptors regulate the resistance of the vessels and therefore blood pressure. We are looking at the kidney, where again they have effects on vasculature. We are looking at blood cells, which are immune cells or immune-related cells, and they have CB1 and CB2 receptors that regulate immune responses, and so on and so forth. There are some areas that are kind of interesting and different because, for example, part of the ability of cannabis to reduce pain, which has been recognized not just popularly, but also in the scientific literature very extensively, is not just due to the effects in the brain, but also to the effects on peripheral nerve terminals that contain the cannabinoid receptors. Similarly, the effects on hunger, the stimulation of hunger, particularly for fatty foods, which is at the core of the quote-unquote munchies, is not just due to receptors in the hypothalamus, which is a region of the brain that controls food intake, but also in the small intestine, where there are receptors that also participate in this control of hunger. So, and just as an aside, we have learned all this stuff in the last 20 years. We knew nothing about this before the discovery of cannabinoid receptors. And we could have had all this knowledge 40 years ago if cannabis had not been illegal. So this is knowledge that we have lost. We have lost time, and we have lost the opportunities to convert this knowledge into new medicines. I just want you to keep that in mind, because how a bad piece of legislation can affect our lives through science or lack thereof, I think it's an important lesson that we need to take home from this. So why do we have cannabinoid receptors? Well, we have cannabinoid receptors not to smoke pot. That's not the way evolution works. We have them because we have our own endogenous cannabinoid compounds, which do not really look chemically like THC. I'm not going to show you the chemical structures, but I just want to point out that they don't look like THC, but they essentially work like THC. So just like THC, they bind to cannabinoid receptors in the brain. And we have them for a purpose, which is not to make us high. It's not to intoxicate us, because they're produced under specific circumstances, only when they're needed. They are produced only in specific regions. And therefore, their actions are a lot more selective than what THC does. Remember, when one uses THC, say one smokes a joint, for example, they absorb the drug goes to the brain, to the rest of the body. It does not really choose what receptor to bind to, right? It goes and binds every receptor it encounters. So the more you get, the more activation you have. That's not what happens with the endocannabinoids. They're produced, as I said, upon demand. They are released when they're needed. And what happens is very, very selective. And here are some of the things that the endocannabinoids do. They regulate feeding, and these are all backed by hundreds, if not thousands, of papers in the scientific literature, work mainly done in animals, but also done in human subjects. So regulation of feeding is really, really important. Again, think about the munchies. Something similar happens endogenously. The regulation of emotion actually turns out to be one of the major functions of the endocannabinoids. There is one endocannabinoid called anandamide. I'll briefly mention it later on, and that is very important in that reaction. Then pain, memory, reward. So a lot of interesting functions. So there are two main endocannabinoids. They're kind of weird compounds that different from other transmitters because they are not, they're actually fat-like. They don't like mixing up with water. They like the fat that makes up the membranes of cells, and they're called lipid-based or lipid-derived mediators or transmitters. So we have two of them. One is called anandamide, which is a cool name. It comes from the Sanskrit ananda, which means bliss, and amide is because of its chemical structure. And the other one has this weird acronym 2AG, which stands for a much longer word, 2-arachidonyl glycerol. I'll spare you that. I'll call it 2AG from now on. So 2AG is what we call a point-to-point messenger, and particularly a point-to-point retrograde messenger. And it does this throughout the brain, throughout the spinal cord. I'll explain that in a minute. Anandamide, it's not that. Anandamide is not a point-to-point retrograde messenger. It's a modulatory transmitter, and I'll explain that as well. So in its capacity as a point-to-point retrograde messenger, 2AG serves many functions in the central nervous system and in the periphery of the body. And anandamide is actually a lot more restrictive in its and selective in its actions in the central nervous system. Is important in two main things: social behavior and stress response. It facilitates social behavior, and it allows us to cope with stress. In the periphery, it predominantly works to curb pain. So here is what 2AG does, and the point-to-point signaling process that I described before. Basically, the 2 points are the postsynaptic membrane and the presynaptic membrane. This is where two neurons contact one another. So transmitters are released from here, they bind to receptors here and produce their action, right? And when this happens, 2AG is produced through this machinery. I won't go into detail, but it's produced. It actually travels back, finds the receptor, the cannabinoid CB1 receptors, and it regulates the release of the transmitter presynaptically. So in this side of the synapse. Clearly, this is the opposite of what a normal transmitter does. A normal transmitter goes from presynaptic to postsynaptic. 2AG goes from postsynaptic to presynaptic to regulate the activity of the presynaptic component. And this is the reason why it's called a retrograde signal and point-to-point, because it goes from one point to another point. So this message is stopped, and nature has been extremely elegant in this. It has put a very nice machinery here to make 2AG, and another nice little machine here, an enzyme called MGL, to destroy 2AG, so that the signal stays in pace and it doesn't go on and on forever. So that's 2AG. Anandamide is a different animal. It acts more like a local modulatory signal. Let me explain what I mean by that. One important function that I mentioned before, in which anandamide is thought to play a role, is social reward. So the pleasure that we as animals, not all animals, but most mammals who are social species, enjoy being with their conspecifics, with their buddies, like this guy here with this other guy here. And the basis for this is actually the activity of a peptide called oxytocin, which is localized to neurons in a specific area of the brain called the hypothalamus, the paraventricular and supraoptic nuclei of the hypothalamus for the aficionados. And these neurons produce their rewarding effects, so make us feel good when we are with our buddies. So when I'm having dinner, for example, with my friend Bob, I'm sure that there is a lot of oxytocin being released in this particular region of my brain, the nucleus accumbens. And what happens is that oxytocin binds to its receptors. And the reason why it causes these rewarding properties is because it releases an anandamide. But an anandamide does not go from presynaptic to postsynaptic or postsynaptic to presynaptic like 2-HG does. An anandamide spreads around throughout the nucleus accumbens and produces its effects on every cell that encounters that has the cannabinoid receptor, so that you can see the difference point-to-point local modulatory signal. And just like 2-HG, an anandamide can be formed and activated upon demand. I'm not going to go into that because I'm running out of time. So the endocannabinoid system, I actually ran out of time. Sorry, I'm going to go quickly to two more slides. The endocannabinoid system, which I just described to you, is not just a system that we have that is so important in so many different things, but also is the system through which THC enters our body. We need to recognize that. So this is the basic logic of the system. You have a precursor in the membrane, is cleaved, the endocannabinoid is produced, then is metabolized. That's a general logic, but the important thing is that, to point out now, is that THC, by activating cannabinoid receptors, can change all that. So we need always to be cognizant of that, because yes, THC is not as dangerous as a lot of other drugs of abuse out there, but it does impact our body. So its use it has to be treated with respect. And that is something that I keep reminding people. This is a drug, treated with respect. No matter how comfortable you feel with it, it has very powerful actions on the body, some of which are good and some of which are not that good. But the fact is that it has actions. But in addition of being the port of entry for THC, is also potentially a source for better medicines. And I want to mention a general idea here. If we have this system, we can, and the system does protective things. I told you, for example, it regulates stress, it regulates pain, right? We could probably do something about it. We can boost the system. There are a lot of ways pharmacologists have invented to do that. We can boost the system and maybe get, without getting intoxication, which is due to the non-discriminate or indiscriminate activation of cannabinoid receptors in the brain, without getting intoxication, maybe one can get analgesia or antidepressant or anti-anxiety effects. One thing that I want to mention, so this would be like blocking endocannabinoid degradation, for example, is a way of enhancing or boosting the activity of the endocannabinoid system. And this has obviously greater selectivity because you're not activating all the receptors at once. You're only activating those receptors that normally would see the endocannabinoid. You're boosting that particular part of the endocannabinoid system, right? And interesting, there is one drug that is in the plant, cannabidiol, I mentioned it before, and Ziva will talk more about it, which may work in part through that. So I am going to stop here. I went 3 minutes above my limit. And we don't have questions now, but I'd like to thank you anyway. And if we have questions later on, I'll be happy to entertain them.
Great. So I think it's my turn now. Those were wonderful introductions to what I will be talking about. Today, I'll be talking about the evidence that we have from rigorous double-blind placebo-controlled studies of the potential therapeutic effects of cannabis and cannabinoids with attention to cannabidiol. And when I talk about rigorous scientific studies, I'm talking about studies in humans where cannabis or its chemicals of the plant were compared to a placebo. I'll be talking about the state of the evidence supporting the therapeutic use of cannabis and cannabinoids, and I'll also be touching on some of the risks that we should be aware of. So there are actually 700 proposed potential therapeutic effects of cannabis and the chemicals of the cannabis plant. And here we have 68 of them. I couldn't fit all 700 into one slide. So we get a lot of questions about what do we actually know about how these different chemicals in the cannabis plant might be therapeutic, what doses are effective, what are some of the risks that are associated with these uses. So first, before I get into the evidence, first I'll talk a little bit about what cannabis is, and Dr. Piamelli already went through this, so I'll breeze through the important components. So what is cannabis? Cannabis has unique constituents called phytocannabinoids, and we know that there are over 140 of these unique constituents. We know most about THC, tetrahydrocannabinol. That is the constituent that is responsible for the plant's intoxicating properties, the cognitive effects, its abuse potential. And we also know that this is the component that is responsible for some of the therapeutic effects of the plant. We're hearing a lot about cannabidiol, CBD, and CBD is becoming increasingly more popular, in part because it is not intoxicating like THC, but it has been shown to have some therapeutic effects in some trials in humans. And there's been a lot of really encouraging data from animal studies suggesting that it might be helpful for a wide range of conditions. There are many other phytocannabinoids, unique constituents that we're starting to hear about pop up: cannabinol, cannabigerol, cannabidivarin, but we actually don't know very much about these other unique constituents. In fact, for the most part, there's been very little done in humans about its potential effects, either their adverse effects or their therapeutic effects. So today we'll be mostly focusing on THC and CBD because this is where the science lies at this point. So what is the evidence supporting the utility of cannabis and cannabinoids as effective therapeutics? And to answer this question, I'm going to draw on findings that we published in 2017. A committee for the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine synthesized all the literature that had been published since the last report in 1999, looking at both the potential therapeutic effects of cannabis and cannabinoids, as well as its adverse effects. And Dr. Piamelli was on this committee, as well as many of our colleagues. So we looked at the evidence supporting the use of cannabis and cannabinoids for 20 of the most qualifying conditions for which people can get medical cannabis across the United States. So we looked at the evidence for these 20 indications. And what we found was that there was substantial evidence supporting the utility of cannabis and cannabinoids for chemotherapy-associated nausea, vomiting, anorexia, and for HIV-associated anorexia and cachexia. Since then, there has been an FDA-approved medication from the cannabis plant that I'll talk about in a minute to help with certain seizure disorders. We also found substantial evidence supporting the use of cannabis and cannabinoids for chronic pain. Now, remember that this evidence was based off of double-blind placebo-controlled studies, these rigorous studies, where certain patients got the active drug, so cannabis or THC or CBD, and another group of patients got placebo, and the effects were compared between the two groups. So we found that there were actually 40 studies that looked at the potential effectiveness of cannabis and cannabinoids to help with chronic pain. Now, interestingly, only 9 of those studies were done with the cannabis flower. 31 of these studies were either done from medications that were taken from the cannabis flower, or they were done with synthetic compounds. All of these studies looked at cannabis and cannabinoids in combination with whatever medication these pain patients were currently using. So none of these studies demonstrated evidence to say that the cannabis and cannabinoids can act alone in helping to reduce pain. All of these studies looked at the cannabis or cannabinoid in conjunction with the medications that people were already taking. So that's a certain limitation with respect to our knowledge about the clinical usefulness of cannabis and cannabinoids on their own to help treat chronic pain. Now, importantly, 0 of these studies were done with the dispensary products that are available in the United States. And so that's a significant gap in our knowledge about how we can perceive the way that the cannabis and cannabinoid products that people are taking every day when they go to dispensaries. We don't actually know about the therapeutic effectiveness or even the potential adverse effects or safety profiles of these products that people are getting on a daily basis. In addition to the conclusion that we found substantial evidence supporting the utility of cannabis and cannabinoids for chronic pain, we also found strong evidence supporting its use for some symptoms of multiple sclerosis. So those were our overarching conclusions. Since then, we know that there have been nice studies, randomized studies, looking at the utility of cannabis and cannabinoids for a number of other conditions. For example, substance use disorders, anxiety, PTSD, and schizophrenia and other psychoses. Now, I just want to point out again that overwhelmingly, these rigorous studies were not done with the cannabis plant, and none of them were done with the dispensary products that people are actually using. So to summarize, we actually have 3 FDA-approved cannabinoids that physicians can prescribe to patients. 3 FDA-approved cannabinoids, which equals to 4 different medications, specific medications. We have dronabinol, which is synthetic THC. So it's just like the chemical THC in the plant, but it's made in the laboratory. It doesn't come from the plant. And there are 2 forms that patients can get the synthetic THC. There's Marinol, which is a pill form, and Syndrose, which is an oral solution. And I'll talk about the indications for which they're approved in a minute. Then there's something called Nabilone, which is another synthetic drug, and it's very much like THC in its chemical structure. And then we have Epidiolex. I would like to point out here that both dronabinol and Nabilone were approved decades ago by the FDA. And there was about a 3-decade span where the FDA didn't approve any other cannabinoid until 2018 when Epidiolex was approved. Now, Epidiolex was really interesting when it was approved because it was the first cannabinoid that was plant-derived. So unlike those other medications that were approved, this one actually came from the cannabis plant. And it was also the first FDA approval for a CBD drug. Okay, so Epidiolex is essentially nearly 100% CBD. So it was a really important shift in 2018 when the FDA approved Epidiolex. So again, we have dronabinol in the form of these capsules, and it's approved for chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting, as well as appetite suppression that goes along with chemotherapy, as well as HIV. And I want to note here that dronabinol in this form is Schedule 3. Remember that the cannabis plant, marijuana, cannabis with more than 0.3% THC is Schedule 1. So here we have synthetic THC in a pill form that's Schedule 3. Next, we have this, and I'll say that this drug is actually being studied extensively for pain. For instance, pain associated with multiple sclerosis and fibromyalgia, as well as multiple sclerosis-induced spasticity. And there are a lot of other indications that this drug is being used to study right now. So we have dronabinol in the pill form, and then we have dronabinol in the oral solution form. Now, even though it's the same drug in the pill, it's Schedule 2. So it's just one step closer to Schedule 1. So there's already a great deal of confusion with respect to the scheduling and how it works. And this drug was approved just a couple of years ago for the same indications that dronabinol in the pill form was approved. But again, the scheduling is different than the pill form. Next, we have this other synthetic THC-like drug called Nabilone. And again, you'll notice here that the scheduling is different. It's Schedule 2, and it's approved for chemotherapy-induced nausea. But there's been quite a number of studies comparing Nabilone to placebo to understand its potential effectiveness for pain, for PTSD, and also for its helpfulness to help people with cannabis use disorder. Then we have Epidiolex, the first FDA-approved plant-derived cannabinoid. And again, this is a CBD-based drug. It's CBD, and it's FDA approved for 3 rare seizure disorders. Now, what's interesting is that when it was first approved, it was Schedule 1 because it came from the cannabis plant. But shortly thereafter, it was moved up to be Schedule 5, meaning that it has therapeutic effect with very limited to no abuse potential. Since then, just a couple of months ago, it became no longer scheduled. So this is the first cannabinoid that is no longer scheduled. There have been a lot of interest in understanding the use of CBD for other indications such as pain, anxiety, schizophrenia, as well as substance use disorders such as opioid and cannabis use disorder. And there have been some studies comparing CBD, Epidiolex, to a placebo for these indications. One thing I want to point out, though, is that for all of these studies, the doses of CBD were higher than 300 milligrams, at least the effective doses were higher than 300 milligrams, which is very different than what people are usually using when they get cannabinol from dispensaries, Typically, the highest dose of cannabidiol that people can get in dispensaries is about 50 milligrams. We don't yet understand the potential therapeutic effectiveness of using 50 milligrams as it's being sold in dispensaries for long periods of time, as people are probably using cannabidiol from dispensaries. Next, these studies were done with Sativex, which is also a cannabis-derived medication. It is Schedule I in the United States, but it's been approved in several other countries. Sativex is a combination of both THC and CBD. It's about 2.5 milligrams of both combined in an oral spray, and it's been approved in certain countries for multiple sclerosis associated spasticity and pain, as well as just for chronic pain. So in Canada, this is approved for chronic pain. Again, in the United States, it is not approved for anything, and in fact, it's Schedule I. So it's just as illegal as the cannabis plant. There have been studies looking at Sativex for the potential use for cannabis use disorder. So to summarize, the data that we have supporting the clinical utility of cannabis and cannabinoids from double-blind placebo-controlled studies are from these 3 FDA-approved cannabinoid-based drugs, from Sativex, the drug that is Schedule I here, but is approved in other countries, and some other experimental formulations. In addition to that, I mentioned before that we do have some studies looking at the cannabis plant in the inhaled form. And so a lot of these studies have actually been done in the United States. So despite all the legal hurdles and regulations that we have to deal with, there have been some very persistent researchers who are interested in understanding the effects of the cannabis plant itself. And because the overwhelming majority of people who use cannabis, at least until very recently, people were generally using it in an inhaled form, either through smoking or through vaporizing. And these studies are usually done with the only cannabis that we can get in the United States. It's a farm in Mississippi, and we get the cannabis from the farm in these cigarettes. And so you can look at the potential impact of cannabis through using these nicely rolled cigarettes that we get from the farm in Mississippi. You can also look at the effects of vaporized cannabis using these 2 methods. And again, there are other methods that you can look at for vaporized cannabis, but these are ones that have been used in the literature thus far. And in fact, this volcano, the middle image, is approved for therapeutic use in some countries. And the advantage of vaporizing is that it's thought to have lower risks associated with respiratory health. So when people vaporize, you're heating up the cannabis plant to the temperature in which the THC either aerosolizes or vaporizes. You're not combusting the plant. And so that's thought to have a protective effect compared to smoking. So to summarize, lots of studies have been done probing the potential therapeutic effect of cannabis and cannabinoids, but we actually don't know about its potential effectiveness for most of the indications that people are using it. And most of these studies have been done with THC or THC-like drugs. There have been some studies looking at CBD by itself, but with respect to certain indications like pain, there have actually been only 2 studies comparing CBD by itself to a placebo for pain. Most studies looking at CBD for pain have combined THC with the CBD. We have 4 FDA-approved cannabinoid-based medications, and only one of them is from the plant, Epidiolex. Several different modes of administration have been studied. We have oral administration, like the oral solution, the oral mucosal spray, the pills, and we also have studies looking at the inhaled form. The effective doses that have been used in these studies vary considerably based off of, well, compared to what's available in dispensaries. So it's clear that even though cannabis is legal for medical purposes for a wide range of conditions, and people are using cannabis and cannabinoids for a wide variety of conditions with different doses, the science has to catch up here. We know very little about the ways that people are actually, we know very little about the implications or the effects of the cannabis and cannabinoids that people are actually using. So I just want to follow up about cannabis being a cause for concern. So based on the National Academy's report, we know that there's an association between cannabis smoking and frequent bronchitis. We know that with THC, there's an association for risk of vehicle crashes. With maternal use of cannabis, presumably with THC, there's an association of low birth weight of the newborn, preterm birth, and increased admittance into the neonatal ICU. We know that there are associations between cannabis use and certain mental health issues. Except for cannabis use disorder, we know that's a causal effect. You cannot get cannabis use disorder unless you use cannabis. We know that there are associations between cannabis use and impaired learning, memory, and attention. And in fact, that has been shown under double-blind placebo-controlled studies that this is an effect. We also know, and this is important with respect to using medical cannabis and CBD, that there is potential for drug-drug interactions. So the potential for THC or CBD to interact with frequently prescribed drugs. And we know for CBD, there's a risk for some liver toxicity issues when administered at very high doses. And lastly, one important adverse effect here to keep in mind is that we don't necessarily know what's in the bottle of the products that people are using because the labeling is not always accurate. So we have rapid industry growth, novel products, new ways to use. Many people are using these products. We do know that cannabis and cannabinoids have therapeutic effects, but we also know that there are adverse effects. So there's a lot of unknowns with respect to safety and effectiveness. And I will save some of these insights into regulations and barriers to research for our discussion, but we have to deal with the DEA, we have to deal with the FDA. There are very few available products for us to study in people, and of course, funding is a challenge. So to summarize, these are significant times for cannabis and cannabinoid research, policy, and health. And we know that cannabis and cannabinoids do hold therapeutic properties, but it's really important that as students and informed public and educators that we both seek to understand what the knowns and unknowns are, and that we share what we know, and that we work together towards establishing the evidence. And for those of you who would like to learn more, please email us here, cannabis@mednet.ucla.edu, or visit our webpage. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. My name is Bonnie Goldstein, and I'm going to be speaking about medical cannabis, clinical considerations, and let me get started on my slideshow, and hopefully everybody can see that. I'm the medical director at Canna Centers Wellness and Education, which is a private medical practice in Los Angeles. I'm also medical advisor to Weed Maps. Just a little background on me. I trained as a pediatrician at Children's Hospital Los Angeles many, many years ago. I was chief resident there. And I got into the practice of critical care transport as well as pediatric emergency medicine. And in 2008, I completely switched gears and started working in the field of cannabis after witnessing the beneficial effects in a close friend. And since then, I've seen over 18,000 patients, including a very large pediatric practice of over 1,000 children that I started seeing in 2013 after everybody saw the CNN documentary on a little girl named Charlotte from Colorado who benefited greatly from the use of CBD. And also, I just published my second book called Cannabis is Medicine last month. So I'd like to start off with a little story about a boy who came to see me a number of years ago. As you can see, his name is Isaiah. His family's given me permission to share his story. At the time, he was 8 years old. He had intractable epilepsy and no pharmaceutical ever helped him. And he was having very frequent seizures. It was impeding his ability to grow and learn and be educated. And interestingly, in his background, he has an uncle who has been basically devastated by seizures that started when he was a young man. There's also an aunt that has a seizure disorder, although not nearly as bad as Isaiah and his uncle. And when his family brought him to see me, his mother said, "I cannot have Isaiah end up like my brother. I just can't do it. And we've been on multiple medications and it's not helping. And we heard about CBD. Is there any way you think this might help him?" So remember that about 60 to 65% of patients will respond to the first, second, or third drug tried for epilepsy, and after that, the chances of responding are pretty slim. This was documented in 2000, and then a review of multiple studies in 2018 was published again showing very similar results despite the addition of new anti-epileptic medications. So I took Isaiah on as a patient, and he started taking CBD oil. And his mom, as you can see, liked to communicate with me via text and these little signs. And you can see here, he's 1 year seizure-free and 5 months pharmaceutical-free, because we were able to wean him off. And then I got another sign. And remember, I was seeing him in between, but she liked to highlight these milestones: 2017, 2 years seizure-free and 1 year pharma-free. And last year, when I was at the IACM conference in Germany in October 2019, I got the text on the left showing the first visit in my office where he had the little mohawk, and then the more recent picture holding his new baby brother celebrating 5 years seizure-free. And just a few days ago, his mom sent me a picture. As you can see, he's grown into a strapping young man here, still seizure-free, going now 6 years. And I'm happy to say that developmentally and intellectually, he is right where he's supposed to be. And he takes both high-dose CBD, about 10 milligram per kilo per day, of a cannabis, whole plant cannabis oil available in California that is tested. We do know what's in the bottle because I require my patients to have their products, always have to have testing, which we'll talk about. He also has a diagnosis of autism, and we do have him added on THC, which has helped him quite a bit with his symptoms of autism, and he's just thriving and doing well. And so one of the reasons that I do what I do is because some children like this who really had exhausted all options now can potentially have some benefit with cannabis medicine. And as has been discussed very well by Dr. Piamelli, is we have this endocannabinoid system, and its role is to maintain balance of messages, to keep us in balance. And so when we have a trigger such as an illness, an infection, inflammation, traumatic insult, what happens is our endocannabinoid system kicks in to help protect, repair, and help us recover, help us get back into homeostasis. And what happens if your endocannabinoid system is not working properly? So back in 2003, Dr. Ethan Russo posited the idea that maybe there are people who are missing an important part of their endocannabinoid system, namely their endocannabinoids, either anandamide or 2-AG. And this is quite interesting, and he posited that maybe patients with migraines, fibromyalgia, irritable bowel syndrome, this triad, and other treatment-resistant conditions, who remember that many people are seeking care, they doctor shop and they look around for treatment, not because they want to do that, it's because they're looking for a solution to their problem. And then in 2008, he revisited this idea, and then again in 2016, where he summarized the current research supporting this theory that these conditions that are difficult to treat may lie with a clinical endocannabinoid deficiency. And now we have this body of knowledge showing that endocannabinoid deficiency or dysfunction may play a role or implicated in all of these conditions that I've listed here. And I've put up some of the articles to the right, but there are many, many more that I would be happy to share with you. If you're interested in any particular condition, I'm happy to point you in the direction. Remember that all this research is not coming from humans, because some of it is, but most of it is actually coming from animals. It's very hard to measure endocannabinoid function. I get a lot of patients that come in and say, well, can you measure my endocannabinoid function? And it's still very difficult to do. And again, now we look at how are phytocannabinoids medicine? How can I, as a physician, justify giving patients medicines that come from the cannabis plant? So remember, the endocannabinoid system, as you've learned, has receptors, endocannabinoids, enzymes, all these other compounds. And phytocannabinoids can mimic endocannabinoids. But we also have learned, especially with CBD, that phytocannabinoids interact with non-endocannabinoid targets in the brain and the body. And back to my little graphic here, we have a trigger, the endocannabinoid system kicks in to protect, repair, and recover. And if we add in phytocannabinoids, what we're doing is helping, hopefully, to augment the endocannabinoid system to assist in protecting, repairing, and recovery, but also hitting some non-endocannabinoid targets as well, which also can lead to the same benefits. Now, here is a chart showing the phytocannabinoid synthesis. Remember, phytocannabinoids are the plant-derived cannabinoids. And you can see on the left, these titles, raw, heated, and aged. And remember that what happens is you have the female flower of the plant, and as that flower is maturing, you have a compound called CBGA, cannabigerolic acid, which then changes as that flower matures, depending on the genetics of the plant. And the genetics will determine which of these enzymes, as you can see, THC synthase, CBDA synthase, and CBCA synthase. And all plants have basically all of them, but they may have a predominance. So remember, if you're thinking about plants being grown for the THC content, they're going to be dominantly THCA synthase enzyme plants, and so on for CBDA and CBC. So what happens is that when you get your raw flower, you actually have compounds in raw form, which is mostly you have THCA, you could have some CBDA, and you could have some CBCA, and so on. What's interesting is that when I started in this field in 2008, we really thought that, at least those of us in the clinical world, because these compounds weren't available clinically, we thought that you had to activate the plant by heating it up in order to get the medicinal benefits. And it turns out that these compounds are biologically active, THCA and CBDA. And by the way, they're both available, at least in the California market, and I do use them. They are potent anti-inflammatories, as I'll mention, as well as not intoxicating compounds. Now, what happens is when humans heat up the plant, you go from THCA to THC, as Ziva was talking about, vaporizing or just, making an extract. You are turning the raw into the heated forms, and what cleaves off here is a carbon and a couple of oxygens. And again, as you can see from the red arrows, these are all compounds that are available on the cannabis market that patients are using. And then we have some aged products, CBN being the main one that's available on the market. And just my clinical experiences, I do not find it to help anybody really with very much. There is this idea that it helps with drowsiness and so on, but it doesn't appear to be something that correlates from research into my clinical findings, although there's lots of products out there and they're all being sold with this idea that they help with sleep. And I cannot tell you how many people have purchased it and told me it did not help. So anyway, this gives us kind of an idea of all these various compounds. And as Ziva said, there's 140, more than 140 compounds. Here's just a select handful. And by the way, very little research on most of these compounds other than THC and CBD. Now, what are the effects? And this has been mentioned, but for THC, what I'll share with you in terms of clinical is it can be intoxicating, and medical patients often are not using intoxicating doses. And there's this term that's being used called microdosing. 1 milligram, 2 milligrams, 3 milligrams may not be enough to intoxicate, but it may be enough to give an anti-anxiety effect, to take the edge off of pain, to help with sleep. But of course, every human being has what I call the ceiling dose, which is where you tip into intoxicating effects. And there are people who enjoy the intoxicating effects as they can step away from their chronic pain, or at least turn off their brain and get some good sleep. What I see THC helping mostly with, reducing pain, helping with nausea and vomiting, stimulating appetite in those patients that are struggling. Of course, if you don't want the stimulating appetite effects, you may have to try a few different strains, or you may have to use a different cannabinoid. Certainly THC works to help to promote sleep. And as I mentioned, you don't need a lot. In fact, sometimes if you take too much, it actually gives the opposite effect. I do find a lot of patients using cannabis for anxiety and depression. And remember that chronic illness, often you get anxiety, depression, chronic pain, and poor sleep. And THC is a nice compound to hit all three of those. Also, we know that it's an anti-inflammatory neuroprotectant. Of course, CBD, which has been found to have at least 65 different targets in the brain and body. And remember, a lot of the targets of CBD are outside of the endocannabinoid system, but we know CBD not to be intoxicating. It can be alerting in low doses and sedating in higher doses. And as Ziva mentioned, you know, the studies are really looking at very high doses. And when someone goes into a dispensary to buy CBD, it's often sold in 5 milligrams or 10 milligrams, or even a little bottle that has 300 milligrams. Well, if you think that your dose is 100 milligrams a day and you just bought a bottle of 300 milligrams, you just bought three days worth of medicine, probably for a very high cost and high taxes. So it would be really nice to define which doses work for which conditions. But I will share with you that as a clinician, I do have pediatric patients. They don't know what they're getting. So I don't think it's a placebo effect. They're getting doses around, you know, 10 or 15 milligrams. They're highly sensitive to it, and the parents report benefits. And then I have other patients getting 600, 800, 900 milligrams a day for seizure disorder or severe behavioral problems due to autism. And so what we say about CBD is there's a very wide range of effects. And many of the patients that come see me have tried it and said it didn't work. And when I ask about dosing, often they are underdosing. In fact, almost all patients who come in who say they've tried CBD and it didn't work are likely underdosing. I do not find CBD to be that great for nausea and vomiting, but it's certainly anti-inflammatory, definitely anti-anxiety and for depression. And the number one reason that I'm using it in my pediatric population is for children who have intractable seizures, who have often tried everything else before coming to my office. Some of the other phytocannabinoids, and again, most of these studies come from animals, and from my clinical experience with patients, THCA is none of these, CBDA, CBG are intoxicating, although THC products, you definitely have to be careful because there's always a little THC in there, and you want to make sure that it's not a very high amount. But I have found both THCA and CBDA clinically to help with nausea, anti-inflammatory. THCA, I have a number of patients who did not respond to CBD for seizure disorders who have responded to THCA, and I even have a handful of kids who are fully seizure-free on THCA. And the beauty of THCA and CBDA is that you can usually use low doses. CBG came out available on the market just a few years ago, and what we're seeing mostly is anti-inflammatory, anti-anxiety effects, for some patients helping with pain. But as I've written here, human trials are desperately needed. That's something that you've kind of hearing from beginning of our talks here today. We are desperate to have the information so that we can help those patients who may respond, and you know, not have people just kind of throwing medicine at themselves to see what works, which unfortunately is some of the way that patients are taking cannabis. Now, certificate of analysis. So everything in a dispensary now, as of 2018 in the state of California anyway, and in a number of other states that have medical cannabis laws, all products require a certificate of analysis. The manufacturer has to test the product, and then the products go to what we call a distribution center, where then they are tested again. In California, what it says on the label, you can only vary by 10% for the total cannabinoids. So if you buy a product that says that each, let's say, little gummy bear is 10 milligrams of THC, it has been tested, and it will go back to the manufacturer to be relabeled if it is less than 10. So remember, 10% of 10, so 1 milligram in each direction. So it may be 9 milligrams, it may be 10, it may be 11, but it's certainly not going to be 3 or 20, which was the problem before we had regulations. But in addition to having the phytocannabinoid profile, for some companies, they do include the terpenes, which are the essential oils. They also have can test for the presence of things that you don't want: residual solvents, pesticides, heavy metals, mold, bacteria. And so my answer to those who say, well, I don't have the COA, is don't buy the product. You must have a COA to protect yourself. And I'm glad that California finally instituted testing of products so that we can have consumer protection as well as consistency from product to product. Clinical uses in adults. So in adult patients, this is the list that we see. And again, why do we see so many different conditions that patients are saying cannabis helps them? Remember, where's your endocannabinoid system? And as you learned, it is all over. And so we see people with sleep disorders, autoimmune, psychiatric illness, cancer, and so on, using cannabis to target the endocannabinoid system as well as some targets outside, with some very good results. And I just share a case report. This is a patient who came to me a few years ago after suffering for 10 years of chronic illness, fatigue, weight gain, ocular migraines, GI distress, joint pain, anxiety, depression, insomnia. And at various times during her 10 years, she was diagnosed with multiple conditions and tried many different treatments, and kind of came to me in a pretty dire straits. And she had already started a gluten-free diet, which she felt was helping somewhat. She was off all pharmaceuticals when I saw her. And so we decided to add cannabis. She was extremely anxious about using anything that had THC in it because she had not had a good experience, back in the day, having a terrible anxiety, paranoia type experience that had colored her view of it. So we started her with a high CBD to THC oil, which was not helpful, despite titrating up the dose. And so at that point, we lowered it down because I just felt that with her, she likely, kind of sounds like an endocannabinoid deficiency based on her history. And we added in a little bit of THC so that she was at a 4-to-1 ratio. We started very low dose, about 4 milligrams of CBD with 1 milligram of THC, and slowly titrated up. And what I'll tell you now, she's on 32 milligrams of CBD a day with 8 milligrams of THC spread throughout the day in 2 to 3 doses. And it resolved almost all of her symptoms. She continued to have some joint pain and some migraines and a little bit of GI upset. And we added in at various times CBG and then the raw cannabinoids. And she's had, I say, 99% resolution of symptoms. So after 8 months, and it took a while, remember, she was chronically ill. Cannabis isn't magic. It's not going to fix everything all at once. But over time, she came back to us and said, I feel normal again. And she very nicely shared this picture of her from this past summer out hiking. And so I've included her story in my book because I just feel that it's such a nice story, and it gives people hope that, if you've been chronically ill, and we know chronic illness, chronic stress, chronic sleep deprivation further depletes your endocannabinoid system. In children, by far, treatment-resistant epilepsy and autism are the two conditions. Again, these are kids that have very few options. There's other conditions as well. This picture is another child where the family has said it's okay to share his story. This is Thomas. He came to me in a wheelchair, unable to walk, with chronic vomiting, epilepsy, chronic treatment-resistant epilepsy, as well as severe self-injurious behavior. And I'm happy to say he's over 90% seizure free, and the self-injurious behavior and the vomiting is completely resolved. And as you can see, I was shocked. He walked into my office when he came to see me. So he's really done well, and he's basically off all pharmaceuticals and doing quite well. Methods of use, and I'm just 2 more slides here. Different ways to take cannabis. By far, what I'm finding with medical patients is they are kind of getting away from inhalation for the most part. That seems to be something that people use when they are kind of used to cannabis. Most new patients to cannabis are not inhaling. Pediatric patients are not really inhaling their medicine. We're using sublingual tinctures and edibles, and also topical. And you can see the various ways, how long they take to kick in, how long they can last, and some notes there. Side effects, and Ziva went over some of the side effects. What I find medically is that if you are on the right regimen, you are not having side effects. My cannabis patients who are doing well with medical supervision do not have side effects. And that is because we have all of these tools in our toolbox, all of these different cannabinoids, which have many overlapping effects. And if THC bothers you, we can switch it out for something else. You can avoid and minimize side effects by one, know what you're taking. And two, starting low dose, titrating up little by little. Don't be anxious about you need to get to your dose that works. You have to take the time, listen to your body, and find what happens. With my pediatric patients, I have the parents reporting feedback pretty much every 1 to 2 weeks. It's the only way that we're going to figure out what will work for these patients. And then, as Ziva also mentioned, potential drug interactions. Anybody taking medications for serious and chronic illness must have medical supervision. CBD is metabolized in the cytochrome P450 system, where 60 to 70% of all pharmaceuticals are metabolized in the same area as CBD. In my experience, high-dose CBD whole plant has not caused problems with the vast majority of my patients. It seems to be much more common with isolates such as Epidiolex, which is 99% pure CBD. Uncommonly, you see side effects with THC, and the ones that I've seen have mostly been in adults who are on blood thinners. And remember, you can have two outcomes with CBD. It can increase the metabolism of the other drug, meaning your body clears that drug quicker and you have less efficacy, which you may not want. And the opposite is that CBD can block the metabolism, decrease the metabolism, which means that that drug is building up in your body and you see increased toxicity. And so really overall, we see it with certain seizure medications, not all, and Epidiolex studies were very helpful in that. Certainly blood thinners, and definitely in my population of patients, the cancer drugs and immunotherapy, we have to be very careful. There are other drugs that can interact, and of course, again, going back to what I said first, is that if you are taking medications for serious and chronic illness, please do not start a cannabis regimen without getting medical supervision. And then here are some of the patients that I take care of. So thank you very much.
There was one question from the audience. Perhaps somebody could start and try to answer. There's a pretty complex question. It's in your chat, but I can read it. I have heard that years of breeding cannabis plants has raised THC content to the point that it's hard to find, quote, native, unquote, THC CBD ratio plants anymore, and that the sum of the entire whole plant phytochemicals are important for balancing out the effect of the plant rather than using man-made extractions. Can you speak about the different ratios and the different effects based on mode of delivery, ingestion, smoke, etc.? I think we touched on this, but this is getting more down to plant-based medicine. And do we have anybody has a comment or an answer to that question?
Well, I have a comment. Look, that's a lot of, there's a lot there, so it's hard to answer that very quickly. No. However, be aware that in California, many growers, cultivators are starting to really incorporate the higher CBD strains into their cultivation, because that is what people want now. And every ratio is out there. You can find products that are already predetermined ratios, like 18:1 or 4:1, or you can get two separate products, CBD product, THC product, and make your own ratio by just looking at the numbers on the bottles. And then in terms of different modes of delivery, that's a long talk. I mentioned it briefly, but I would be happy if you want to email me. I can send you my email and I'd be happy to send you that slide.
Well, hello, everyone. My name is Richard Wallace. I'm the founder of Equity and Transformation. I also sit on the policy table leadership team at the Movement for Black Lives, and I'm also partnered with the Black Men Build Coalition. So E is the name of the organization I started in 2018. It stands for Equity and Transformation. It was founded by post-incarcerated people from the city of Chicago to uplift the voices and power of Black informal workers. For folks who don't know what the informal economy is, or just being, just being introduced to equity and transformation, the informal economy is essentially a diversified set of economic activities, enterprises, jobs, and workers that are not regulated or protected by the state. The mission of our organization is to build, the mission of Equity and Transformation is to build social and economic equity for Black workers engaged in the informal economy. We do that by building comprehensive campaigns, which are grounded in base building, research, advocacy, policy development, and communications. Our recent win, we're proud essentially to announce that he won our first campaign within our first year. And on Friday, May 31st, 2019, Illinois became the 11th state to legalize cannabis, and the policy we informed was being praised as one of the most equity-centric policies in the nation. And it was the first, I believe, to incorporate reparations for the war on drugs. And so what we did essentially in our work is that we began researching the Illinois' current medical industry. And we realized that out of 55 licenses that were awarded, not one of them was Black. They had some definitions around people of color, but there wasn't any Black winners of the wars, which was alarming considering the war on drugs ravaged through Black communities. In fact, nationwide, Black Americans are almost 3.5 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis than white Americans, despite the fact that cannabis use is equal amongst the two. This wasn't shocking to me to learn those statistics. In fact, it's the norm. Looking deeper into US history, you recognize a troubling trend, and that is that occupations that exist in the informal economy, one, they're not fixed. They often migrate from informal to formal. And at the stage of formality, right, we're talking about informality and formality, there's a lack of retention of Black bodies on the opposite end of the sector, right? So once it becomes legal, there's a lack of retention in both Black ownership and the workforce. So you see those trends when you look at, historically looking back at like bootlegging alcohol to today's current, alcohol manufacturing industry. And what you see there is you see when it was informal, you had a host of Black innovators that were involved in the market, invested in the market. And then the second it becomes legalized, you really can't find a Black alcohol manufacturer. You will find Black labels, but you won't find Black alcohol manufacturing at a large scale. So we set out to frame essentially our fight in Illinois around a jobs fight, demanding for equitable transition of Black informal workers into this newly formed $9.5 billion cannabis industry. And additionally, we wanted full reparations for the war on drugs, right? Because I don't think that we can begin to move into the future of cannabis without reconciling the past, right? And in the past, that's where it hits home for me, is that a number of my friends and colleagues and kids that I grew up, some of their first encounters with police were around cannabis. Either it was smoking weed and getting caught in school or running from the police or whatever because they had some weed on them. This was their introduction into the prison industrial complex. And then from that, as we know, there's collateral consequences to incarceration for all of the folks who started with cannabis, right? And then it may escalate because they get out, they can't find a job, or they're not, society doesn't look them in the eyes because of their past record. And so this is a continuation, almost a snowballing of impact that it had on communities. We have children that were separated from families because of cannabis. You have people that are currently still sitting in cells because of cannabis. And yet there's this large economy, this bolstering economy that exists now for the same exact practice, right? And what that says to me is that when poor people make a decision that I'm gonna sell this cannabis in order to put food on the table, that's criminal. But when multi-billionaires say that they're gonna sell cannabis, not because they need the capital, but essentially because they want to make more capital, that becomes legal, right? So for me, that was an interesting pivot, but it was something that needed to be done in order to really drive home the equitable outcomes that we were trying to fight for. So the concept of racial equity is defined by pre-existing racial inequity. So I think a lot of times people, we hear the catchphrase equity all the time now, but we have to look further into it, because equity is you only need to fight for equity if inequity exists, right? So we don't fight for equity unless an inequity has occurred. Lifting up that inequity serves as a demand for an intervention. And that's the way we kind of build our campaigns. Like, you see the fight for equity, which is generally used all over the place, but the articulation of the inequity is something that you have to dig deep for, right? So equity for us is a visioning framework. It prescribes a destination, and at Equity and Transformation, we believe the reparations is a necessary step to get to that destination. So that's the reason why we defined and demanded reparations for the war on drugs. Equity, again, is fair treatment. It's really about fairness. But reparations is something we had to go deep on in order to identify. And so we looked at the UN's definition of reparations, right? And they basically have 5 pillars. The first pillar is a guarantee of non-repetition. And this is United Nations came up with these definitions. So the first was a guarantee of non-repetition. Under international law, a state is responsible for wrongfully injuring people, is under obligation to A, cease the act if it is continuing, and B, offer appropriate assurances of guarantees of non-repetition. That's something we did not win in our fight, right? We were able to achieve that. Like, if you are caught with cannabis, it's just a $50 fine for the first arrest. I think it's $100 for the second arrest. It's not a jailable offense any longer, but it still does go on your record, right? The second pillar is restitution and/or restitution. Restitution means that we reestablish the situation which existed before the wrongful act was committed. And the wrongful act essentially is the crime bill, is the war on drugs. And so what did our communities look like before that, right? And so we also incorporated that in some of our demands, right? Compensation, the injuring state, which is our state, Illinois, is obligated to compensate for damage if the damage is not made good by restitution. Compensation is required for any financial accessible damage suffered, right? And so when you think about families that were separated because of cannabis, and people, there's a lot of attention to the 500 youth that were separated at the border. And we have to not forget that for every person, every parent that's behind prison walls right now, they are separated from their children too, right? Every person that is separated from their family for cannabis related offenses, those children are also separated from their families. So we think about compensation in that realm. Like, what does it look like? Satisfaction is another component of it. And satisfaction is a part of full reparations under international law for moral damage, emotional injury, mental suffering, and injury to reputation. So when you think about emotional injury or mental suffering, that is something that goes on in our communities on a regular basis due to cannabis, right? Going to jail is part of that. When you think about family separation, again, it comes up. And then the last but not least, there's a component that's called rehabilitation. Rehabilitation shall be provided, including legal, medical, psychological, and other care services. So what we landed on, Illinois, and I'm rushing through this. If you have questions, feel free to post them in the Q&A. What we had in Illinois, we got close. You know what I mean? I want to say that, like, we got close. We had it. We had a lot of things incorporated. And when we first, the House bill that we first got to it, they had about 80% of the tax revenue from cannabis going to police pensions. There was no language in it around social equity applicant designations. There was no language in it around expungements, pardons, etc. There was very little language in it around those specific components. So when we began to advocate, I think an advocacy is an important piece. we held a number of community conversations and dialogues about what was coming, right? A lot of folks did not know that, one, recreational cannabis was legal, and two, that that medicinal cannabis was legal, was available, and two, that recreational cannabis was coming. And nor that that a lot of people in the public have knowledge around how do you get into this this recreational cannabis economy. So we started hosting these things called, the first one was called, in all honesty, was called the Cannabis Equity Talk, right? And like no one showed up, right? And I was like, okay, again, checking myself and saying, well, who is our audience, right? And so we organized what we call a chronic conversation, and we had hundreds of people show up, right? And all we did was same content, different name, and we discussed what is called the Compassionate Care Act, which was the medical industry, or was a medical law, and we discussed what in it caused caused there wasn't a lot of eligible Black applicants at that time. And so from, I think, the chronic conversations and from some of the research that we did and the reports that we drafted, we're able to land on a few pieces that I think are important to lift up now, right? So we did get some restoration of rights, 800,000, nearly 800,000 records in Illinois of 800,000 people with cannabis-related offenses will have their records expunged through House Bill 1438. Car impoundment, which was extremely important. There was over 400 cars impounded like the month right before cannabis was legalized in Illinois for cannabis. And as of January 1st, cannabis has been removed from the city's vehicle impound program. Around possession, if an Illinois resident is found in violation of possession limits outlined by the state, the maximum penalty is $50 for the first offense, $100 for subsequent offenses within a 30-day period. I think the real meat of it lands in the wheelhouse of racial equity. Through the campaign, we're able to fight for and win the following racial equity measures. One was the social equity applicant designation. So in the application process, you had to identify that you're a social equity applicant. It was on a points system. And by doing that, we're able to identify disproportionately impacted areas. So areas that were disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. And so those areas are where people were, is where the social equity designation lands, right? So you had to come from a DIA in order to be defined as a social equity applicant. 50% of the fees were waived for social equity applicants. There was also a low interest loan program for social equity applicants, and 30% of all tax revenue to the city of Chicago via cannabis sales went directly into this R3 program to be reinvested into communities most affected by the war on drugs. So those are the things that we won, right? And I think that's important to lift up that we have a great place to start from. We do have to continue to fight and articulate our demands to ensure that predatory lending and partnerships. There is this thing. There was 3 social equity applicant designations, and the third of the social equity applicant designations, designation C, essentially said that you could apply as a social equity applicant if you had 10 or more current employees that came from disproportionately impacted areas. The problem with that is that, one, it said current employees, right? So that means that these are current operators, and under the Illinois medical program, 55 awardees. There's only 55 active dispensaries in Illinois. 55 licenses were awarded, right? So if you're a current, right, this is before the new wave of recreational licenses came out. To have current employees, you had to be operating. So there were no social equity applicants operating, so that designation wasn't for them. And so we saw a lot of very predatory practices where people would just go sign up 10 Black people from the DIA, say that they were social equity applicants, and move forward. And so that was one of the challenges this is thinking about HB, the House bill, the recreational bill. And so racial equity is about applying justice and a little bit of common sense to the system. We continue to do that fight. And one of the things that we notice around, why this round of social equity applicants, there were some challenges, is that, credentialism was extremely harmful. We need innovation as it relates to credentialism. I consider, and we consider credentialism a new form of racism. We're never going to see whites only water fountains again. That's not the era that we're living in. It is definitely hidden in the credentials, right? The people that are accessible to people. And what we see is a host of credentials necessary to enter this particular market. And we're talking about weed, right? And I think that a lot of people, I think part of this professionalization of the cannabis work is about excluding particular populations, right? So we told, like, you think about someone who was selling weed before, it was like they were selling weed and that was criminalized and it was all this, that, and the other. And now it's like folks are now innovators, right? And it doesn't look the same. The culture of it isn't the same. So it's like they've culturally cleansed cannabis to a place where the people who are historically involved in the legacy market are excluded from the market today. And that doesn't show up, like I said, in the form of, explicit racism. It shows up in the fact that, and I think that I don't want to speak in universals because I'm from the city of Chicago, and this city is like 30% Black. It has one of the highest racial wealth gaps in the nation. It has one of the highest rates of Black unemployment in the nation. 75% of the homicide offenders are young Black men ages 17 to 24, 17 to 35. 71% of the victims of homicides are also young Black men ages 17 to 35. This is the context in which I'm speaking from. So if we do not write language specifically around equity and fairness, right, that attributes that content, that data, right, in order to identify who is eligible, right, and defining eligibility is one of the most challenging things that we have to begin to study and understand, is that who you define as eligible and the rubric for that definition can be racist, right? So if we say, like I often say that like you don't have to say this is whites only. You can say it's, like a coffee shop. You don't have to say this coffee shop is whites only, but you can say the coffee itself is $10 a cup, right? And if you put it in a community, right, where the average per capita income, like West Garfield Park, is $12,000, then you know who is not going to access that coffee shop, right? It's as simple as that. And so it doesn't necessarily always move the way that we've seen racism move in the past, but it does articulate itself in the actual end results. And the end results of the Compassionate Care Act was that there was no Black dispensary owners, yet we knew there was an interest for from Black people to enter the market. And so that's really been our work, right? Our work on a regular basis is to continue to build pressure to ensure an equitable transition for Black informal workers into this robust cannabis economy. We also push and we're doing a lot of other work. We're doing a lot of work around mutual aid, and COVID-19 impacted our communities hard. So that's really what I had to say today. And I'd love to answer any questions you all have.
I think we could transition into the panel discussion. So I would just like to begin it, where we've heard 4 very different presentations that span the whole realm of what in the academy is called translational science, from bench to bedside to the community. So I would like to throw out the question that was really raised by Bob in this first presentation on the legal history. What kind of things can can be, from your studies on the legal history and your interest in repartitions, what can they, what can the community that Richard is speaking from and his movement, what can they learn from this, and what advice could you give them for moving this agenda forward?
Thank you. Sorry I can't turn on my video either.
Yeah.
But I absolutely 100% agree with Richard that we need to view this from the context of reparations. Let me start my video. Here's my head and my COVID beard. You know, the idea of 40 acres and a mule is a great model because it started with African-American leaders in Georgia talking to General Sherman, and General Sherman had the wisdom, instead of having a top-down federal policy, to say, what can we do to help your former slave community succeed? And African-American community said, we need land, we need 40 acres, and we believe it should be offshore in this fertile savanna, off Savannah, Georgia, fertile islands. We will succeed. And guess what? They did. The mule came later. The mule's great. And those communities would have continued to succeed, except for the fact that the federal government left, would not enforce the policy other than General Sherman. No one really wanted to enforce it, and white racists took over the communities and stole the land. That's just fact. Yeah, I'm biased, but that's just historical fact. So now we come to California, and you know, as Richard said, it's really nationwide that we had this racist policy. In the 1990s, with the passage of the Controlled Substances Act, the Nixon administration was absolutely clear, in retrospect, that we're going to go after the Black community and the anti-war community, and we're going to embarrass both. And guess what? The anti-war community, of which, you know, I was a privileged white member, did not suffer. The Black community suffered, and people went to jail. And again, this is just fact. We have the numbers, and people went to jail for things that should not have been crimes. So if we look at this in terms of reparations, we have in our statute, the California statute, a requirement to look at equity. It's not working. And it's not going to work unless we look at issues like availability to capital, availability to business experience, the kind of partnerships that can work. And I'm going to start, you know, a little bit further than Richard. I don't think that we should look at this as all things being equal. I think we start with absolutely what do we need to make a Black-led enterprise work. And if that means capital, if that means preference, here's the dirty secret about affirmative action. It worked. Where we have had affirmative action, a transitional period, people get pissed off, and eventually we have more equitable workplace, more equitable educational systems. That's what we need to do. Is this a question of anything beyond political will? No. It's simply a question of political will, and so far we have not shown that we are willing to go that route. It's doable. It's actually pretty easy to do. Believe me, there's plenty of white people with capital and banks and investors who will line up to form worthwhile, meaningful partnerships if they're told that's the only way they can get into the business.
Thank you.
Not that I have strong views on this.
No, that's what this panel is all about, is strong views. And I think we need it because, as we understand, it's really from the research point of view, you know, this is from research to racial equity. If we can't work together, and not only politically, but in our thought and thinking, new strategies, new models, new theories that link the two, we're just doomed to do the same. And this whole conference is about integrative health and bringing communities together with research and trying to figure this out. So, like from a clinical point of view, Bonnie, you know, with your work with children, what do you see as a kind of a partnership that could emerge out of your work with the Black community, with the people that that Richard is working on to democratize the dispensary system? Is there, because children are, as you saw from Reefer Madness, it was all about having children being used to whip up sentiment for draconian laws. But what is the role of your work with children clinical and your patients with these communities and the context that they need to operate? Could you please unmute? Yeah, you're mute.
Here we go. How about now? There you go.
Yeah, great.
So I think, you know, it's a hard question to answer because, you know, when I'm seeing patients, I'm, you know, I have to be honest, I'm more concerned about the overwhelming medical condition. Look, if you're a child and you're in my office, you're in pretty bad shape. People don't just come in for boo-boos. They're coming in for severe, chronic, usually last resort chance to have a quality of life. And the biggest thing that I see, though, is really more of the lower socioeconomic versus the people who can afford their medicine. So one of the biggest problems I have had in California is families saying to me, it's not covered by insurance, my child needs high doses, and we cannot afford the medicine. And that is so heartbreaking to me. And often it is people of color who cannot afford the medicine because those are the people who are often and have been kept in a lower socioeconomic status. And so, you know, for most parents, especially the ones that I see, again, it's a pretty skewed population, but they're out there and we can't ignore them. In fact, Children's Hospital LA is just go stand by the front door. You're going to see these families, right? One of the biggest problems is that in California, the taxes on the medicine are ridiculous. And if you're not aware of it, currently when you go into a dispensary, if you even with a medical letter, you are paying almost 30% tax on your medicine. Okay, there's a 15% base tax. Then there's what's called the sales and use tax, which runs between 7 and 9.5 or 10%. And then like the city of LA has a 5% for medical and an added on 10%. It's ridiculous. Why should people be paying that kind of money on medicine that is often life-saving or life-changing for their child? And believe me, they would rather just go to the local pharmacy and pick up medicine that is covered by insurance. It's so much easier, my goodness. But their child doesn't respond to that. That's how they ended up using cannabis to begin with. And this idea that people don't want to use pharmaceuticals for their children and they want to use cannabis. I have families spending thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars a year, and many of them have gotten into debt and so on. So that's where I see the inequity, and that's, you know, what I'm starting. I just got asked to work with a project for veterans for this new proposition that came out, was passed last year, that allows for donated medicine. But now what I'd like to see is something for pediatric patients for them to be able to get their medication donated as well. I hope that helps.
That helps a lot, because there's a real parallel with what's going out in the streets with the dispensaries and the ownership here in LA. I'll talk very specifically about the gap between what's the so-called illegal market and the legal market, because the profit motive is driving the dispensaries with how it's regulated, controlled, and and people can't afford it. And I'm not only talking about poor people. So it's stimulating a whole homegrown movement. And I think this partnership, so to speak, this what you need and what your children, patients need, and where to get it is a future a future action that I think we need to talk about. I have another question from the audience. I'll read it. It's in the chat. It says, it seems like a lot of education is needed all around for legislators and the general public in cannabis, which spans a very complex landscape of laws, science, and equity. Where do you believe education and communication campaigns may be the most effective to help move these issues forward? Where should efforts be focused? Anybody want to take a stab at it?
I could say, well, in Chicago, I think, I mean, for us, it's our local elected officials in our state, at the state level and the local level is where we have to do the most education. And I think that because, you know, cannabis is entering the arena, the state arena, in the same way that that all businesses are considered businesses. So at the application process goes through, you have to go through ZBA, the zoning business administration. You have to pay all the fees that you would for any other license, et cetera, et cetera. But the difference is the population historically that was part of this, right? There's been no assessment of their assets, right? And therefore, what they've done is they've created like a hole to jump through, right? A loop to jump through that all businesses generally jump through, right? The challenge is with our community in particular is that we have to change the threshold to meet the community, right? Like it's like the assumption is that we can just put the threshold out there, or put the rubric out there, how we want to define it, and that it's open to everyone. Anybody can do it. Anybody can do it. But you know that we have one of the highest racial wealth gaps in the nation. You know we have some of the highest rates of unemployment in the nation. You know that in Chicago, you close 50 schools in black and brown neighborhoods, and the education gap. Like, you know all of these things, and then you create something based off previous systems, right? That you say everyone can jump through. And the challenge is that they can't. Even with the social equity designations that we saw, there was only 21 perfect scores this round. And the majority of those folks were like political insiders, which is a whole nother problem, right? You know what I mean? Like, so that was a whole nother issue that we had to tackle. So I think just around that, I think we have to educate our elected officials. We have to begin to create, I think a lot of our institutions have to begin doing research on like what are the current assets in our communities in order to help redefine some of the licensing practices and like the eligibility crisis, I think, that we have in Illinois. Like, we have to begin to rearrange that in ways that are beneficial to the communities we're trying to see elevated through our policies.
I'll try to interject as well along the lines that Richard started, bring in in the fold the medical and scientific community as well. My experience educating legislators has not been extremely successful. I've been many times, you know, in places either in Sacramento or DC, and it is sometimes disheartening to see how little we who are educators and scientists impact their view of the world. I think actually they respond much more to other pressures than the pressure of knowledge. And I think this is a time when this is especially striking, as I'm sure everyone who watches the news knows. But I do think that we have a basic need to educate three strata of the population. One is the medical students. I think we do need to have a broader, more solid understanding of what cannabis is and what it does, the benefits, the risks, solidly based on the mountain of science that we already have. And we need our students, our medical students, to understand that and appreciate that. If they don't hear from medical educators and you go out in the world, it becomes extremely harder. They're busy, they have other pressures. They need to have that seed planted in their educational infrastructure before they go out and start with their career. So medical doctors. The second is nurses. I think the nurses are actually the thin blue line. And I have to say that they're much more receptive by and large to this message because they see people suffering constantly, and I think they respond to that human factor a little bit more than our current science-based medical education allows physicians to do. We are sometimes frowned upon if we introduce a human factor, either in science or in medicine, which I think is an aberration, but that's unfortunately what is currently happening. Nurses are above that in large part, and I've spoken to nurse groups who have, I think, been very receptive to this. So I think nurses are important. But there is yet a third stratum, and I think that is college students, and particularly college in underrepresented, colleges that are predominantly frequented by underrepresented minorities. So black colleges, etc. Why that is important? That is important for a variety of reasons. So one reason is that we need more researchers who bring in different perspectives into this problem. And I say different, I'm not just saying the black perspective, I say any perspective, the different experiences, we need them because otherwise science cannot really thrive unless we have this variety of different views. Science is an inherently human endeavor, and social endeavor is not something that happens in an ivory tower where Einstein, you know, with his funny hair is doing strange things. That's not the way science works. Science is a social endeavor, and it's a human endeavor. We need to have diversity, and we need to get the diversity from the very beginning, because in the time on college, if you're, say, I want to make an example of a black kid, I'm thinking about, for example, our current vice president-elect. Obviously, if you want to make a difference, you learn to make a difference in politics, but there is only so much difference you can make in politics. Politics is a realm of the possibilities, but science is where really possibilities becomes facts, because we now have knowledge of the world, and we can bring that knowledge of the world to bear to advance the case of progress. And that is where I think we need more. We need to start education in all walks of society, in all ethnic groups, in a much more thorough way than they're doing right now. Paradoxically, in schools like mine, I am at University of California, Irvine. University of California has very broad, tries to be as open to all minorities, and in fact encourages minorities application, etc. But it's too late, because the number of people where we receive, the number of applications that we receive from minorities are very small. Some minorities are more represented than others. We have, luckily, a very large group of Latinos and Latinas who apply, not as many black folks, no Native American. So that is really the challenge that we have. I think education is number one, but we need to highlight, I would say, medical, nursing, and colleges.
Yeah, yes, that's going, excellent point, and especially the focus on students. You know, I'd like to let you know that this is really a follow-up of the breakout session we had 2 years ago at the conference that was 2 years, where we worked very closely with the UCLA Cannabis Initiative, and also at the level of the students at both UCLA and USC. And it's starting to be a national movement, is a Canna Club, a club of students who are really interested in all aspects of cannabis, from and it goes up to even the dean of business is very interested in at USC about how do you make ethical business, and how do you organize it? And the students of the Canna Clubs are really a vanguard, at least in our university, and what we know in our partnership with UCLA on this. So that might be a Carissa, for example, is on, who's in the back room making things happen for all of us. She is on the board of the Canna Club USC, and the club has very close relationships and works and has questions and want programs that impact all of the things that we've said today. So Ziva, I wonder, you know, the 2008, it was Jeff Chen, and now you're the director of the UCLA Cannabis Initiative. How do you see the education factor in terms of the UCLA Cannabis Initiative? I know it's called a research initiative, and in universities we like to put things in boxes, you know, research and education, and they're two separate things. But how does it work at UCLA with the research initiative?
Thank you for the introduction. So I came to UCLA about 2 years ago to be their research director, specifically focusing on research. Even though it's the Cannabis Research Initiative, we do have a couple of different pillars that we're interested in building. And so since then, when I became director, I decided that I was going to branch out from just focusing on research, which I focus on noon and night, and dealing with the regulations and trying to develop collaborations across the campus, to also really work on branching out and defining our educational initiatives. And so one, speaking to what Daniele just talked about with undergraduate students. So we actually started a 4-credit undergrad and graduate course this past semester that is focusing on cannabis and cannabinoids from pharmacology to public policy. And it's really geared towards students from all backgrounds. Although we predominantly get neuroscience students, about 50% are people in economics or public policy. We have a couple of dance majors, anthropology majors. And it's really to educate people on what cannabis is, what is the science, what do we know about it. We bring in physicians who are UCLA faculty and beyond, who talk about their experiences and what they know. And we also have public policy experts. So it really gives students a real breadth of knowledge about what we know beyond what we see in the headlines, which can be really confusing for a lot of people, students in the general community. And we've also established community monthly events, which are now virtual, cannabis conversations during COVID. And we target important questions that we hear from the community are important. And we get people from California as well as the East Coast who can attend. I mean, that's one of the good things about these virtual events, is that anybody can really join. But one area that I think is really interesting is breaking into the law school, as well as public policy schools, and reaching out to the students that are studying the legal aspects. And as far as I know, UCLA does not have curriculum dedicated specifically to speak to a lot of the legal issues that have emerged throughout our conversation here today. And maybe Bob, maybe you can talk about if anything is moving at UCI with respect to that.
Well, for better or worse, I'm it at the moment. Although I guess, I think people are expanding some. Professor Joe Demento actually has a book on land use, and for years he's had a section in it as an environmental issue under cannabis. Increasingly, large law firms are looking at cannabis clients, including real estate deals, because it's highly regulated. And when I offered my course, I had a variety of lawyers coming in, and it's amazing how broad the practice has become. One of them says, well, I've always done dirt deals, now I do cannabis dirt deals. And what that means to a lawyer is I'm looking for a big warehouse that has infrastructure, including lighting and electric and water, As a lawyer, you try to get your client the piece of real estate that's going to suit their needs, whether it be a house or an office or a place to grow cannabis. You know, one of the things that Danielle and I have talked about, and in fact written a piece that one day we should publish, is that lawyers and scientists speak a different language. And that's a big problem because legislators are not generally scientists, they're generally lawyers. And lawyers are writing these statutes without any real understanding of not only the science, but what a scientist means by there is or is not evidence. And lawyers like to pass cannabis bills based on tax projections, where in the state they live, in Humboldt County, where we have an active cannabis growing, business for, probably 100 years. How is that going to affect locals? What does it mean to be in the city? What does equity mean? And we just write this stuff with no real planning. And then we say, well, we need a regulatory agency. So let's take the people who used to run the Bureau of Alcohol Regulation. That seems similar. Well, in some ways it is, in some ways it isn't. And let's put them in charge. So we don't put much thought in, and then you're all sitting here, and I'm like totally impressed by what you're all doing. And I even dragged my teenage son to a UCI talk on the effects of cannabis on the adolescent brain, because that's pretty important, to him and to me. And so the answer of where does knowledge start and end, we have to encompass everything. We should be doing this in high school classes. Back to Bonnie's point, the legislators should be aware this is a medicine, and it should be regulated like a medicine, not like an alcoholic beverage. There's so much, I don't even know where to begin except at the beginning. But there's a lot of law jobs connected to the cannabis industry, and law school deans like courses that lead to law school jobs. That I can say unequivocally.
So Professor Solomon, my dear friend Bob, is also an optimist. I am pathologically an optimist, but at the same time, I have the cynical view of him being around the block a couple of times. So I want to go back to the issue of educating the legislators, because we cannot wait to educate a new generation of medical doctors, nurses, and yet another generation of researchers to have change. The change is facing us right now. We have an election. We had an election with the results that are very, very clear to almost everyone in the world. And the effect of that election are tangible. They're tangible, because I think that this is not a political statement at all. This is more it's a statement with respect to the cannabis legalization issue and how we can achieve that in a way that is sound. This is now the time to go to our university officials, to those who take care of federal relationships at USC, at UCLA, at UCI, and any other institution, and say, look, we need to organize talks to the staffers, workshops to the staffers in DC. Some of you might have done that. I have done that many times. It is a frustrating experience at times, but it's also a very, very important thing to do. And you cannot just have one. You need to have multiple. You need to have a campaign done by many to do, if not the education, because educating legislators is hard. They don't respond to the same motivation. They don't have the same motivations. They don't have the same incentives that we folks have. They have different ones. And those, what we need to anchor their thinking to science somehow. And to do that, what we need to do is two things: understand better what their motivations are. And for that, we need to communicate and be able now to translate our fancy science and all our emotional things. Because, when Bonnie shows a photograph of a kid, that speaks to everyone. But don't assume that that speaks to the legislator. That speaks to the voters. That speaks to the constituents. It doesn't speak necessarily to the legislator. They can or cannot answer to that, respond to that. So we need now, in the next year and a half maximum, we need to actually make a strong push. I am optimistic because I don't think that cannabis is a partisan issue. I really don't. I had here, right here in my office, one of the most right-wing members of Congress. His name was mentioned before, a libertarian by the name of Dana Rohrabacher. And I also had left-wing members of Congress and the state legislation here with completely opposite views. And they all agreed that, we need to solve the cannabis problem because it is a problem. It's a problem to them, to their constituents, so it's a problem to them. We as scientists must help. And to do that, this is now the time to do it. Not tomorrow, not in 5 years, not when we'll have the new generation of medical doctors. Now, with the forces that we have, it's a kind of a call to action. And but I do think it's a timely one, and that's why I'm bringing it up.
Yeah, that's definitely a call to action. And I'm wondering, really, what is the damage that's being done to science by the existing political structure? In other words, for example, even in the clinical research, all the cannabis comes from the University of Mississippi's farm through the DEA, but we also know out in the community and there's a huge, I alluded to it, the homegrown self-care. There's all sorts of genetics going on, all sorts of plants, plant medicine going on. There isn't the access to labs, but there is some access to labs. So there's a lot of accumulated knowledge that can't be used, or even the plant itself can't be investigated because of the current bureaucracy. But how can science really develop under these regulations? I think your point, Daniele, is that it can't. And that's why the call for emergency is here, because we really need to have political and social action to break down these walls, because the communities need the knowledge, and I think you also in the lab need the freedom to investigate what is on the frontiers of science.
Thank you. That's a lovely question, Ziva. If you wanna interject at any time, please do so. Let's put things in context. Okay, so scientists don't get incarcerated. Okay, we don't get incarcerated. So our suffering is of a different nature, right? So we are frustrated because we would love to do the science, we would love to do the work. We know that that work will lead somewhere because of our, formation, etc. But we can't do it. And this is something that for the non-scientists in the panel and in the audience, they need to understand this: that everyone in this audience can right now leave, go to a dispensary, get a product, buy it legally, go back home and use it. You can do that, and it's legal, and nobody can hurt you for that. But if I do that as a scientist, I go there, I buy the product, come here to my lab where I am in my office right now, I go to the lab, and someone finds out, off I go to federal prison, because that is a federal offense. I am in breach of the CSA, the 1970 Controlled Substance Act. And university has to, obviously, abide by the law, for the simple reason that we receive funding from the federal government. We don't receive funding from some benefactor. So that is really important for everyone to understand. If scientists are not doing the work, it's not because we don't want to do the work. It's because really it is hard to do this work. Now, is it impossible? No, it is not impossible. Nothing is impossible. We can, and when we do, Ziba does, I do, but every time we make an observation, we say, oh, it would be nice now to do this other study. For example, to do a study with a higher dose of high potency cannabis. Then I have to write a protocol that has to go to the DEA, then it has to go to the California office or whatever, and I have to get all the stamps. And by the time I get all the approvals, I even forgot what the heck I was thinking about. It's 3 months later, 6 months later, if they didn't lose the paperwork, because that happened to me with the DEA several times. So it is really a frustration that and they're not going to incarcerate me, obviously. But if I can do my job, it is also pretty bad, you know.
Yeah, yeah, that's exactly my point. So I mean, we're living with this reality, so we know we have to change the laws, the regulatory system. But at least we've made the big move to a legal framework from the old illegal. But it's a new world out there that we have more freedom, but also more resistance. Like you said,
can I just interject a really important point to what you
please.
What you just said? When Daniele and I met with the general counsel of UCI about a donation that we received, the university is very risk averse about any donations that go to cannabis, and a 2-hour discussion, and it was 2 hours, can be summed up by me saying, this is a legal enterprise. Yeah. And the general counsel saying, no, it's not. And here's the problem. We're both right. Because the university, and some of us attended a couple meetings held by the president, and like all universities, we're risk averse. We're concerned about federal funding. And there is a belief with the current administration that an administration, federal administration, is unlikely to take action against a state university system. But if they do, we all know it's going to be the University of California. So we're all dealing with probabilities. And when there's so much money involved, the probability is we don't give a crap about your little donation. We're not going to let you spend it. And that's the way it is. And so to say it's a legal enterprise, it's not. It's legal under state law. It's illegal under federal law. And the Supreme Court has said the only thing that matters is federal law. Yeah, we have a lot of Republican senators who say, don't touch my state. You know who saved us during the William Sessions years? Cory Gardner, the senator who just lost from Colorado. Why did he save us? Because Colorado is pretty dependent on the amount of tax dollars they get. That's what moves legislators. And now that we have so many legislators, including Republicans, we have a chance. Do you know why the Senate did not pass the bill that the House passed? Because Mike Lee, the senator from Utah, says it's against federal law. I'm not letting the committee consider it, period. That's how our government works, that one person has the power to stop it. If it went to a vote, would 3 Republicans jump the aisle and vote yes? Sure. We have to make that happen. Maybe it will. Daniele's right. I'm a Pollyanna because I think these things will happen because I think that evolution works. Eventually people get a little bit smarter. Not the senator from Alabama who doesn't even know the judiciary is a branch of government. So he'll be against cannabis, but someone else will say it's time.
Well, if I may, this is a nice, lovely conversation. The one time I met Lindsey Graham was when he invited me to go to Washington to talk about cannabis. And the reason why he brought it up is not because he's particularly progressive. I figure that it's much as known to the entire group here. But a bunch of people, a bunch of constituents in his constituency, wherever he's from, they told him, this is important. Medical cannabis is important. This is what I think we need to accomplish. We need as scientists to be able to provide the sort of and researchers and physicians and advocates the context, so that when this pressure comes from the bottom, actually it can be operated upon by the legislators. And I am cynical. My friends know this about me, but I'm also an optimist. And I think that now is the time to do it, because I think we have a window of opportunity in between the Senate, the presidency, and the House. It is a window of opportunity that we should try and take.
Okay,
He and I have this conversation every week, and
yeah.
he likes to say cynical, but he's pretty optimistic at bottom line.
Yeah, yeah, like me saying,
well, here's the real cynic here, okay? The real cynic here is that even if the legislation changes and cannabis is somehow moved from Schedule 1 to some other thing, it is still going to be really hard to study. I mean, even with, us being compliant, we have our Schedule 1 licenses. I essentially design my studies around what cannabis or what cannabis product I can actually give to humans that the FDA will say, it's okay, it's safe, there's no mold, no pesticides. It's a hard thing to do. So I do hope that there is flexibility to make these regulations and these hurdles easier, because I think that we are losing valuable people who can add to our research enterprise and grow what we know. Because it is mind-numbing work to get through these regulations, and smart people are going to move and do something easier and more productive. And so I do hope that those regulations do get easier, but I think there will always be some challenges. But and I hope that I see that in, over the next decade, 2 decades, or 3 decades, but it's going to be a hard, long road. And every one of my colleagues who commits themselves to doing this work, I'm incredibly grateful. And here, I just came to UCLA and trying to encourage people who are initially interested and they're excited about doing it. And then when they see how much work it is, they slowly peter off, and, trying to be that cheerleader to say that it pays off. It is really worth it. There are so many questions to ask here, and so many people, so many experts in other fields that we need to help answer those important questions. So, it's frustrating at times, but hopefully some of the regulations will be eased in some respect and make things a little bit easier. But I guess I'm a cynic, and I don't know when that's going to happen, even if it does move off of Schedule 1 status.
I'll be your human subject.
Yeah, it's a long march, but there's some convergence here that was very interesting around what Richard said, how on his event where he organized it in such a way where nobody showed, but then when it was turned into a chronic conversation, this sounds, and then lots of people came. I think that converges what I heard from Ziva with her community conversations that the University Cannabis Initiative is doing now. Could maybe both of you give a little bit more depth or detail on what went on? Did that bring a little bit of less frustration and a little bit more optimism, or what was the effect on the communities and on the university from those conversations?
I guess I can go. Yeah, so I think I think there's a lot of ways to say you're welcome without just saying you're welcome, right? I think we have to, I think that's part of one of the things that equity and transformation is trying to really wrestle with is like, who is our audience? Because we speak to our audience. Like right now I'm in a specific code, I'm speaking to an audience that I'm here to speak to, right? But I think we speak to different audiences different ways, right? And I think it's important that an option out of the audiences that we declare need to be there, or the language that we're speaking in, to ensure that we speak to specific people in specific ways, to ensure their inclusion in the space, right? Because I know that I've picked up things and like read it and said, oh, this isn't for me, right? Like I know this isn't for me. I've walked in spaces and felt like, oh no, this space isn't for me. And so it's really, for me, it's about making and curating a space that is accessible for people that we know need to have access to this information, right? And so the chronic conversation became one where we had doctors and lawyers and everyday folks from Chicago all engaging in the same space. And it was like an opportunity to exchange social capital and mix social capital with folks, right? Folks that had street experience in the economy, and folks that were fighting for policy changes. And then we also had people that were authoring policy in the same place at the same time. And the difference is that we have organized conversations that were specifically for policymakers and expected community to show up, right? Like, hey, you should show up, because they're like, who is that? I don't even know who that is. But by targeting and facing community with the language, we're able to create a space where community was open to showing up. And then the legislators showed up anyway, because it's in their interest to be there and would be there with community. So that was, I think, the interesting kind of twist that occurred with our chronic conversation. And the benefits were that, one, community had opportunity to meet with legislators. Legislators got to hear from community members. Policymakers were able to actually advocate in the voice of community. And also it just energized our work in a way that propelled us through the campaign.
Yeah, and Ziva, what was happening over here in LA when you went out and had these conversations?
So we use the word conversations in a little bit of a different context. The cannabis conversations during COVID are monthly events where we have a conversation, and this is a pretty small group, so I'll be candid. It's usually a conversation between me and a scientist who's doing work in the field, addressing some of the really important questions that we're having now about cannabis. And the conversation is made to give the general audience the information as to what's happening, what goes into doing this research, and what are the take-home messages. So for instance, one of our first conversations that we had was with Don Tashkin, who is at UCLA. He started doing cannabis research in the 1970s. He was one of two researchers at UCLA who was doing cannabis work, one of the only researchers in the US who was doing cannabis work at the time, looking at the impact of cannabis on lung function and lung health, a very important point to discuss during COVID. And so the idea was to talk about his work and to talk about the important issues and findings that he had, which was actually really interesting. Every single one of his hypotheses that he started off with, investigating the potential for cannabis smoking to be associated with lung cancer, or having a pro-asthmatic effect. His findings were actually contrary to what he thought he was going to find. So he had a really interesting scientific journey in general as a human being, as an academic and scholar. So his story itself is interesting, and also his science on top of it was interesting. So it's not a conversation with the general community. We have the general community register and log on and learn. But it's more of a conversation between myself and somebody else who I really like to talk to. And thankfully, other people find it interesting too, or else it would be a really boring hour for most people. But it's great. We've had a lot of community engagement. And UCLA is very happy to host these events.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's what we're in search of, more on the ground mechanisms that we could use to make this translation back and forth take place, and so that's the wave. Danielle, I have a question too, because in terms of knowledge transfer, you know, I think probably it'll be one of the greatest discoveries ever in science. Maybe it's Newton, but you know, the discovery of the endocannabinoid system and how weird it is compared to the other systems that that we've got, and so one of the great things that we have is Daniele's lab right close to us, doing doing inner space research. So I wondered, as a sort of as we reach the end of this, what are your most exciting findings that maybe are not yet published, but you think that we need to know now to motivate us out there to for the fight that lies ahead, and what to support what you need to go forward?
Thank you. Well, research in the endocannabinoid system is not as hard as research with cannabis, because as long as you don't touch THC, as long as you don't touch the plant, I mean, we have access to also to financial resources, to the federal government mostly, and they've been actually fairly generous. The National Institute on Drug Abuse has been always very supportive of research on the endocannabinoid system. And one of the reasons is because they see our knowledge of the endocannabinoid system as a way to replace the cannabis plant. And now, in full disclosure, I agree with that. I do think that cannabis has a lot of potential, but also a lot of issues. It's not an easy drug to use. Not everyone can use it well. Bonnie certainly can, but you know, it takes experience, it takes a lot of formation, and not everyone can, and not everyone wants to. So the endocannabinoid system per se offers a series of interesting opportunities. Again, the idea is to tweak the system so that we fix deficiencies of the system that may be responsible for particular pathological conditions, such as, for example, chronic pain. And so my lab's research over the years has been mostly on the endocannabinoid system. We have developed drugs that, medications that, by and large, boost the activity of the different components of the system. So I told you there were two main endocannabinoids and anandamide 2-AG. They serve overlapping but different functions, and we're lucky that they have different mechanisms through which they get destroyed. So we can develop specific inhibitors for one destruction, the other destruction, and if you inhibit the destruction of something, of course, what happens, that something accumulates, and now you start getting interesting effects. So I think that in the next, this is where I'm really optimistic, but I think in the next 5 years, we will know for a fact as to whether the endocannabinoid system is as promising as it has been supposed to be for the past 20 years. We are at that point now because accumulation of basic science experiments, along with a number of hiccups in the clinical enterprise, have now allowed us to get a much greater knowledge and experience. So we move forward in areas particularly like post-traumatic stress disorder, in areas like chronic pain, particularly chronic pain in the periphery of the body, that is the pain produced, for example, by chemotherapeutic agents, which have this sort of causes neuropathology that is inherently very painful. So those are two areas where I'm hoping, post-traumatic stress disorders, social anxiety on one end and pain on the other, I'm hoping that drugs that boost the endocannabinoid system will find soon a place in therapy. And I'm hopeful that that will also increase the overall understanding in the non-scientific community of how these receptors, of the signaling system is important. And now we can also, you know, given the appropriate knowledge, we can also tweak it using cannabis, not necessarily using a new class of drugs, also using cannabis.
Well, we're heading towards the end. there's a whole domain that we haven't gone into here. It's around recreational use. You know, it's from a medical point of view, we're looking at it, and totally from you know, a medical treatment of a disease. But are there any thoughts about recreational use? Is there any benefits or good aspects having to do with like the sociability or these things that we've seen in animal that need to be researched and need to be explored?
I don't want to monopolize the conversation. Just a quick thought.
Anybody?
If you're looking at a recreation, by definition, you're not looking at benefits. The benefit is in the recreation itself. What you're looking at predominantly is risks. And that is really where I think, even in that regard, research is really outdated, because we need to understand, we need to reduce harm as opposed to say, just say no. As you know, Bob was alluding before, if you say, just say no, you don't have to do anything. Just say no, right? If you cannot say no, and you're accepting now the idea this is part of our culture, which in 44 of our states it is the case, well, no, fewer than that, but in many states this is the case, clearly the problem becomes, what are the risks? And we would be, I think, we would be seriously amiss if we thought that there are no risks associated with cannabis use. They may not be the risks associated, the risks that we have heard about, because there's been so much BS on it. We are biased. Oh, no, there is no risk. There are risks. There always are. And we need to understand them. So we need to do that research. And that's the other reason why we really need a legislative change here, because those are actually a lot more serious, in my opinion, because so many millions of people are going to be using cannabis thinking it's absolutely harmless. And for 90% of the people, it is harmless. Maybe for 95% of the people, it's harmless. But it's that 5% that we need to worry about.
Okay. So anybody have a last comment? It's been a long afternoon. We made it, almost the 3 hours, which is, I thank everybody for their time. And since this is a conference on healing communities and integrative health, on the 2008, I began the session with a poem of one of my favorite poets about hemp. And maybe this is appropriate just to make the link back to 2018 at the end. The poem is from Gary Snyder in his book, the book Turtle Island, which is a Native American term for the Americas, won the Pulitzer Prize in 1975. So we know what 1975 was like. But his words: hemp, gravel bars, river banks, scars of the glaciers, healing and nursing moraine. Tall hemp plants followed man, midden, dump heap, roadway slash, to bind his loads and ease his mind, moored to Spain, Spain in horse manure and straw across the sea and up from Mexico. A tiny puff of white cloud far away, we sit and wait for days and pray for rain. So with that last word, if anybody has anything else to say, please do. But thank you all for spending the Saturday afternoon with us. And